President Donald Trump apparently feeling the pressure from this impeachment probe, now calling Republicans who oppose him, quote, human scum, and, of course, made waves by trying to say that this lawful investigation was a, quote, lynching earlier this week. This may be part of the product of the absence of a clear legal defense or even a message war room. It's a go-it-alone response from a man who has famously declared, I alone can fix it, and he deals with the ultimate self-inflicted crisis with some problems, Trump haunted by testimony from the very diplomats who he's been attacking. So right now, we turn to an expert, Tony Schwartz, co-author of The Art of the Deal, friend of the beat, who says today it is Trump's own worst instincts that have him behaving erratically and that are boomeranging on him. Now, I want to show you something as we get to Tony. Donald Trump has always been aggressive. That was his brand. But take a look at just one comparison, how his once conversational tone decades ago to outline that aggressive style has turned to what critics today say is a full-on meltdown.
I'm unrelenting to people that treat me badly.
They know they can't win the 2020 election, so they're pursuing the insane impeachment witch hunt.
I fight hard when I believe in something, and I'm good to my family and I'm good to my friends.
These are bad people. My phone call, as an example, with the president of Ukraine was perfect. We're dealing with some very sick and deranged people.
And now joining me for our State of Mind series again, back on the beat, Tony Schwartz, CEO of the Energy Project, author of The Way We're Working Isn't Working. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
You say that while much of this is in the same ballpark in content, something else is happening with him as he faces what could be existential pressure.
Well, I think he's a different person, as we all are, under what he experiences, and in some way rightly, as a survival threat. I mean, there's no question that his presidency and therefore his whole sense of himself is at tremendous risk now. And I think, as most people do, but particularly those people who have a limited repertoire, when we are under stress, what we tend to do is double down. And what worked for us in the past becomes a liability, becomes, even in his case, self-destructive. So aggression turns into insistence and demand and viciousness that ends up coming back on him.
So that brings us to the real wildest part of this as a story. You told me once how you would sit with Donald Trump while he worked the phones, and you kind of had to just track all of his different rambling, ongoing stuff. And to be fair, he did achieve certain things. He was effective in certain ways, although many people find him highly amoral. But this is not effective, what he's done here. What do you see, as someone who's been around those phone calls, in the significance of the day after the Mueller testimony, when he might finally take a gasp, when even Republicans and conservatives who feared that the Democrats would impeach for anything, they didn't. And the Mueller testimony was seen a certain way in Washington, whether people agree or not. Washington saw it as not enough to impeach. And he turns around the next day and gets on this call and does this undoing, as you put it, of his presidency.
What I see is that he's a person who has a death wish that's always been there, a self-destructive impulse. The way he views the world is that nearly everyone now is out to get him. And what he does is he creates the evidence to reinforce the view. It's like a vicious cycle. So he's constantly making true what he, in his paranoid way, fears is true.
That his raw cynicism, you say everything for him is basically a transaction. It's hard for him to understand even the notion that there are ethics in government or business, right?
The word is invisible to him, doesn't mean anything.
So you're saying that in that cynicism, he then uncorks things that create a cycle that then reinforces his cynical view.
Yeah, it's funny to call it cynical. I think it's more literally a need to see the world as against him at all moments, because then he can be reactive and responsive and in his mind protect himself. But
and say this is how it is.
Right. But the defense nearly always produces exactly what it's meant to defend against. So he's bringing his worst fears to life by doing what he's doing.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about then trying to get the world to react a certain way, it's classic Joker and Dark Knight Rises, where he pits the two boats against each other. He wants to prove people will kill each other for nothing. And then he watches, hoping they'll live that out because he has that belief. I don't want to give away the end, so I won't. Stay with me. Often we sit here and we do whatever you want to call this, just me and you around a table. But I want to advance the conversation with someone who knows Trump in a different way, a former Republican Congressman, Carlos Curbelo, who's been quite critical in public of the Ukraine call. Thanks for joining me and Tony.
Good evening from Miami, Ari.
Good evening. Welcome to Miami, as Will Smith would say. So you hear Tony. You've spoken out and served alongside with Donald Trump. What do you think of Tony's points, and is that part of what's happening here?
Yeah, I think President Trump is that kid, that friend that we all had, maybe in high school, that does something wrong, and then you ask him, hey, why'd you do that? Didn't you know there was probably a good chance you were going to get caught? And he says, yeah, I knew I was probably going to get caught. And they don't care. And that's the only way to really explain or understand this behavior, Ari, because as you said, right after the Mueller testimony, he makes this call. While this scandal is breaking, he defies congressional Republicans with this Syria action. Then he decides to choose the Doral Resort here in Miami for the G7. I mean, this is someone who wants to get in trouble, right?
So what do you think your colleagues, particularly on the Senate side, are thinking right now? We definitely saw some this week who didn't sound like the House Republicans, who didn't sound like Senator Graham, but who were really walking away from this after Ambassador Taylor and at least didn't want to be in the front edge of defending this on Ukraine.
There's a lot of introspection going on in the Senate right now, specifically in the Senate Republican caucus, Ari. There's a significant group of Republican senators who understand the gravity of this, understand that this isn't just about one man, Donald Trump. This is about the institutions that keep people free and safe and that have made us the greatest country in the world. My family fled a country where the institutions broke down and they lost everything. So I'm particularly sensitive to this. And thankfully, there are many Republicans who are as well. They're not yet speaking out. Some are, very few. But I think what we're seeing in the House from a small group of House Republicans is far different than what's going on.
Let me bring in Tony, but let me also build on the congressman's point, which is there's been several blowbacks already. The Syria foreign policy issues, the reversing himself on the hotel, and Mitch McConnell, who obviously appears to be trying to walk the line, but he's publicly saying, hey, you can't believe everything Trump says about this investigation. I want to play that for you. Take a look.
I read Mitch McConnell's statement yesterday, and he read my phone call. And as you know, he put out a statement that said that was the most innocent phone call he's read. And I spoke to him about it, too.
The president has said that you told him that his phone call with the Ukrainian president was perfect and innocent. Do you believe that the president has handled this Ukrainian situation perfectly?
We've not had any conversations on that subject.
So he was lying about that?
You have to ask him. I don't recall any conversations with the president about that phone call.
Well, I want to go back to the point that the congressman was making because I so disagree with it. And I know you invite this.
We do. Congressman, get ready. Are you ready?
I do not buy the idea that Republican members of Congress are going through introspection. They have known the truth about Trump for the 3 years plus that he's been president. And what they're going through, or if they're going through a kind of introspection, is an introspection about their self-interest. Their self-interest has told them, regardless of the threat to the institutions of democracy, I'm going to protect myself. Now what they're saying is maybe supporting Trump isn't in my self-interest.
Right. You're saying it all comes back to that. Let me let the congressman respond, sir.
Well, Ari, a couple things. Number one, I'm not a mind reader. I'm only going by what I'm hearing and what Republican senators have told people. Number two, that clip that you just played of Mitch McConnell, that is significant. Anyone who knows Mitch McConnell knows that the typical answer from Mitch McConnell would have been, I don't discuss my private conversations with the president. Mitch McConnell did not say that. He made a point to say that what the president had stated was untrue. That is a big deal. I understand For a lot of people, that's not enough. But for those of us who follow this closely and who know these characters, we know it's significant.
I'm over on time, so you each get one sentence. Tony?
I agree that Mitch McConnell did something very unusual. He did it because he recognizes that the tides are shifting, and maybe it's in his interest to push against Trump in a way he never has.
Congressman?
I think anything's possible. Those people who assume that Republicans are just going to fall in line the way they have for the last 3 years might be in for a surprise. We'll see.
Very interesting thinking about what each of you are saying and the interplay in between. Tony Schwartz and former Congressman Curbelo, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ari.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.